Good evening. I'm David Wilson, the President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and really what I want to do is just very briefly give a very warm welcome to all of you to the Royal Society. It's a sort of unusual event for us, in a way, the sort of discussion format. Subject, yeah, I don't think we've done something like this before, not while I've been President, but that's only for a year and a half. And I like the way that the title is designed to show that it takes the sciences as well as the arts, and this whole idea of the chemistry. This was sort of to slip it into our program in case any of the scientists thought that we shouldn't be doing this. But we should. And why should we? Because we're the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and we, unlike the Royal Society of London, which has reduced itself just to the sciences, and you have a British Academy, we do what the Royal Society of London originally did, which is we cover the whole waterfront of intellectual life in Scotland, and we're very proud and happy to do that. And these sort of public lectures, for those of you who haven't been here before, are all part of that. It's a very special evening, as I said. I think we're extremely pleased to be doing this. And the person who's going to more or less organize it is Alec Riddick. And so just briefly about him, I think he's known to everybody here, but as you all know, he became General Director of Scottish Opera in February 4 years ago. And before that, he had for 4 years been in charge of NBR New Zealand Opera. He was Executive Director of the New Zealand International Festival of the Arts, and when he was Deputy Director of that festival, he had responsibility for that enormously successful first foray by the Edinburgh Tattoo to New Zealand, a model which has been copied and is being tried since. And he's been involved throughout his working life in a whole number of different arts festivals, major art festivals, and he was involved here in the Fringe, I think, for some 8 years, Alex. And he has played a key role in the concept of new ways of putting across opera, some of which we will, I hope, hear about tonight. And with that, Alex, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
I was explaining earlier that, in fact, I've been around Edinburgh long enough to remember the last time that the assembly rooms were refurbished. We thought we'd do this relatively informally and invite my colleagues, Andrew Clark, reviewer for the Financial Times, prestigious newspaper, very well-informed and knowledgeable critic. Invite Andrew to come and join me, as well as Louise Welsh and Stuart MacRae, composer, librettist, fantastic creative team who are beginning work on their next project. I thought I'd take a moment initially just to set the scene. As Lord Wilson said, I've been with the company 4 years, and we're just over. And when I started with Scottish Opera, I was presented with what I consider to be a reasonably interesting challenge, which was really, it was not really that well articulated, but the essence of it was, what is Scottish Opera? What is Scottish Opera's point of view to the 21st century? And noting that it was a company that had come out of a considerable amount of difficulty in the past, noting that we had a very strong tradition of representing the 17th, 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, noting that we possibly could embrace more of a televisual journey with large screen opera or capture for DVD, and noting that all of that was far too expensive and beyond our means, and at the same time falling into conversation with a range of very clever composers and writers around Scotland. It seemed to me that the best place to start was to take a point of view about the creation of new work here in Scotland. And many of you will be familiar with all of this to one extent or another, but I just wanted to say briefly that the starting point was to say, well, accepting that opera, particularly a full-length opera, can take 3, 4, even 5 years from sort of first germ of an idea all the way through to through to performance. It seemed to me back in 2006-07 that I wasn't entirely sure we had 4 or 5 years to wait for any sort of ideas to emerge. I then, as some of you will be aware, I fell into conversation with a particular composer who shall remain nameless, but basically I said to him, I hadn't met him before, and I said to him, well, you're late. What do you mean I'm late? Well, you haven't written the opera you promised. Oh, right. And I could tell from the twinkle in his eye that, in fact, this was a matter of some interest to him. Over the course of the next 6 months, I fell into conversation with all sorts of writers, composers and other clever people around Scotland, and it emerged that there was a significant groundswell of interest in having new operas made, created, developed here in the country. So the first thing we did really was put some shape to it all and effectively create a format called 515 Operas Made in Scotland. And the imagery in my mind as we were playing around with the words was a combination of sort of the Iron Brew advertisements and sort of girders, which was a sense of sort of industry, purposeful industry, and work that clearly identified with this country. Now, so we did our first season in 2008, 5 short operas, 15 minutes long. By the way, the reason they were 15 minutes long was that there was a sense that anything over 15 minutes might be quite hard to pull together in the time we had available, because I felt that once I'd started to assemble teams of people willing to make work, I felt the next thing to do was to try and get these things, these operas, these pieces on stage as quickly as possible, which only gave us about a year from the first time we started thinking about it to the performance. Secondly, it was also noting that in 15 minutes you can't get into too much trouble. And certainly from an audience perspective, that if 1 minute in you realise that you weren't enjoying it, you had to endure another 14 minutes. You know? But at another level, it was also acknowledging that actually what I was really interested in was the notion that, and all of this remains firmly, you know, my opinion, if you like. So right or wrong, I guess history will be the judge of it, but my opinion of work, of contemporary work that I'd seen in the UK over the years leading up to 2006 was that for many good reasons it focused extensively on the composer and didn't spend enough time working with or on the librettist or the narrative or the story or the idea. And so I wanted to use 515, for better or worse, as a means, effectively applying a methodology that said, first of all, we start with a one-page treatment, that if you know, the creative team, maybe the writer or the composer or the pair of them would come to Scottish Opera with an idea. And it seemed to me that if you could express the idea on one page, then you had a reasonably good grasp of the idea. Then we would invite that idea to be fleshed out into something resembling a synopsis and then a libretto, and only then would we really begin to merge words and music together. Now, that isn't necessarily a model that's worked in every case, but that's a sort of underpinning philosophy. The other thing is that some marriages came to us, ready assembled, between writer and composer, and in the finest traditions of show businesses, other marriages had to be arranged. The quality I've personally looked for in all of our creative teams is a willingness for both parties to speak truthfully and honestly to each other. And in fact, some of the best pieces that I think we've done have been where the writer and the composer have looked at each other and gone, look, actually, this idea is rubbish. We need to start again, or we need to swing that way or swing back that way. And a number of composers, certainly, that I've spoken to have, you know, acknowledged the pain in letting go some of the best music they've written, but needing to let it go because it's not advancing the opera. And I come back to, if you like, the definition of opera, which for me is, you know, a judicious blend of music and theatre. It's storytelling with music. There are all sorts of other, you know, variations on a theme, but in essence, it's about using music and theatre to tell stories. So I was very keen to bring together creative people who could tell stories through our fantastic art form. Again, at the back of my mind was actually that this 515 model of short operas, which incidentally went on in 2 years, is sold out. We've created 10 pieces and we've sold out 16 performances. We've got another 5 pieces due to premiere mid-May. At the back of my mind was not really that 15-minute operas were in themselves an art form, but more that they were a stepping stone to composers and creative folk, writers, directors working on making longer work, because it has always been my ambition from the outset that this 15-minute model would be a muscle building, an opera muscle building process, so that ultimately we could have Scottish Opera can every 2 or so years present a full-length work. But it occurred to me in looking around Scotland and talking to everybody that there was a good deal of work to be done in encouraging everybody to develop their ideas, to build their muscles, to practice. And so I've been, you know, greatly heartened by the willingness of everybody to participate in our 515 project. The other thing that surprised me enormously has been the sort of viral spread of the notion of 515, not only with the number of librettos and scripts and scores that come across my desk on a weekly basis here in Scotland, but also the fact that we've entered into at early stages of a partnership with Cape Town Opera in Cape Town, who wrote to me a little while ago to say, look, we'd really heard about and enjoyed your 515 idea. We're thinking of launching 520. And I said, well, if you're going to do that, make sure you add operas made in South Africa on the end of it before anyone else nicks the idea, you know. And indeed, later this year, one of our 515 pieces will be joining some world premieres in Cape Town in November. A visit I'm looking forward to because I believe it's rather warm down there. We've also enjoyed, early days, but of a burgeoning partnership with Tapestry, which is a new music entity privately run in Toronto in Canada. They invited 3 of our creative folk to Toronto last summer, put them with three Canadians, and between the 6 of them they invented 9 5-minute operas. Now, to make sure that there was a degree of pressure, not that there isn't pressure, but to make sure there was sufficient pressure, each creative pairing was given 48 hours with which to come up with their 5-minute opera. Now, what's spawned from that, of course, is that now some of these pieces have been represented in Rostov, and in fact, in this forthcoming 515, you'll see that we have Vitaly Hodosh, who's an important Rostovian composer who's been working in partnership with the RSAMD, who has also created a short 15-minute opera for us. And interestingly, the Limbury studio, which is part of the Royal Opera House too in London, are also now introducing various manifestations of short new operas. Quietly pleased that what started off as a small idea here in Scotland is, you know, one way or the other in a viral fashion spread around the world. The other point I just wanted to make was that all of this has been possible at Scottish Opera really through private support, that it's required almost no investment from the company and certainly no investment from the government in making 515 happen. So I think it's a great articulation of the willingness of folk in Scotland to really get behind new and good ideas. I think that's pretty much my introductory remarks. I just wanted to say a couple more things, one of which is that Louise and Stuart are working on a longer piece for us for 2012, having succeeded so well with Remembrance Day in 2009. They're under very strict instructions not to give the game away. But really what I wanted to do was ask Andrew to set a bit of a scene, a bit of a historical context in terms of the relationship between the librettist and the composer and that crucial partnership. Thank you.
I think it's very important, before these two have their say, to sketch in some of the background about how, as Alex says, how composers and librettists have worked in the past so that we can understand where the art form is today. And also just to set this whole process of creating new operas, to set that in the context of the whole historical dimension of opera and how we can see it as an evolving process in time over centuries. So first, a little historical perspective. And by the way, I want to also compare what we're doing what is being done in Scotland today with what is going on in the creation of opera in other parts of the world at the moment, which is actually quite different to what's going on here, despite these initiatives that have spun off from 515 in Scotland. Opera, as I think we all know, has its roots in 17th century Italy. It grew out of popular entertainment, involving all the arts: music, song, storytelling, drama, poetry, movement, design. By the 18th century, opera as we know it today was an established art form. But it was an art form for the privileged. The emphasis was still on entertainment. But the composer worked on a by your leave from his patron, either an aristocratic public, as in Handel's London, or from a king, as at Versailles. All the composer needed was a poet to give him a text that could spark his musical creativity. preferably a good poet, but a bad one would do if the music was good. Metastasio, the Viennese court librettist, churned out hundreds of librettos for whoever would pay him. The librettos in those days were a formula. As the 18th century progressed, so did opera. Reflecting the society around it, it got bolder, as Mozart's Da Ponte trilogy demonstrates. These operas not only talked of love and tragedy, The Marriage of Figaro talked of impending social change. Beethoven's Fidelio, written less than 20 years later, in the wake of the French Revolution, treated the themes of tyranny and justice. Weber's Der Freischütz, about a decade later, written shortly after Wagner was born, hinted at all sorts of psychological complexities and social taboos. Already, composers and librettists were talking about things that were worlds away from the mythical love stories and contortions that preoccupied their 17th and 18th century predecessors. As the 19th century progressed, opera became a bourgeois art form. The composer was king, no longer his patron. The composer had to entertain, but he also had to respond to the romantic ideal of art as something edifying and uplifting. Like his predecessors, he was invariably a practicing musician, maybe an opera conductor, as Wagner was, and later Strauss and Zemlinsky. At that time, the composer was always the dominant partner. You never come across a good libretto with a poor score. You're much more likely to come, occasionally you will find a good score with a very poor libretto that has somehow survived into the modern day. The composer was still subject to the censorship rules of the day in the 19th century, but he provided the vision. Librettists were mostly hacks. They were there to do the composer's bidding, as we know from all the correspondence that Verdi had with such librettists as Piave. Piave worked in the theatre in Venice. He was employed by the theatre. That was his job. There was not only the composer and the conductor and all the other people, musicians in the opera house, there was a resident hack who wrote librettos. And Verdi, as was his wont, bullied Piave into doing what he wanted, often substituting his own words, Verdi's own words, for his librettist. The librettist didn't have a leg to stand on. In Verdi's case, we're very glad he did. Moving on to the 20th century, the problem with opera in the last 100 years is that it has lost touch with its roots as a popular entertainment. Modernism took it into the ivory tower. Its musical language became cut off from traditional melody and harmony. In 1959, Pierre Boulez could famously call for the blowing up of opera houses. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, one of his fellow post-war modernists who were wanting to make a completely new start in music, basically turning their back on the past, Stockhausen used opera as a receptacle for his wild and wacky New Age visions, which provided some wonderful moments in the opera house, but they went on not just for hours, but for days. It was too egotistical. It wasn't practical. And their Italian confrère, Luciano Berio, at heart a lyrical composer who would have been actually fantastic if he had felt like working in traditional models, he renounced his faith in opera in favor of what he called musical action, a collage of ideas that had no coherent shape. Thanks to these post-war developments, composers lost touch with opera houses. They didn't work in them any longer. They retreated into the ivory tower of academia. Opera was for them a bourgeois, decadent art. It wasn't for intellectuals. And of course, if composers weren't composing operas, librettists weren't writing librettos. The gift of libretto writing, such as it was lost. Meanwhile, popular culture took over. Film and TV supplanted opera in the popular consciousness. They were taking the role that in previous centuries opera had fulfilled. There were exceptions, of course, Britain and Henze being the most notable. But it was predominantly in film and television, the new media, that creative talents wanted to work. Literary talents, designers, and so on. By the late 20th century, let's say the 1980s, opera had become predominantly an interpretative art form. It was not really a creative one. The creativity was to be found in directing, in designing, finding new meaning for old established tales. It was as if opera had become a second-hand art. The opera house was now a museum. It had completely lost touch with the composer-performer who, along with his literary counterpart, worked in opera on a daily basis and knew its ways. Well, as we know, over the last 15 years, opera has fought back. It doesn't want to be regarded as an art form of the past. It does want a future. So, how well is it doing? Judging by Scottish Opera's 515, composers and authors may lack practical experience, but there's no shortage of enthusiasm for it. There are enough people around, creators around today, in the musical field, in the literary field, to want to try their hand. That's good. That's probably different from what it was 30, 40 years ago. So what is going on in the wider world? Well, in Aldeburgh and London, there have been composer librettist workshops, one run by the Genesis Foundation, for example, in London at the Almeida Theatre, and other variants on it in Aldeburgh. But, to judge from some of the results, some of these would-be composer librettist partnerships really want to try to reinvent the wheel. They make elementary mistakes in doing so. Yes, they're entitled to experiment, but none of them have hardly any of them have actually taken the trouble to go to the opera house on a regular basis and listen to what makes a successful opera. Some don't even believe in the proscenium arch. They think opera should be a happening in an open space, in and around the audience. Not surprisingly, many of these experiments have failed. In Europe and America, the experience is somewhat different. In Germany today, for example, you can't write an opera unless you still have some sort of modernist credentials. Every season, the major opera houses try to announce one new opera in their program as if to pretend that the art form is alive and well and they're doing their bit. New work is somehow supposed to take shape in 3 acts with the full ensemble of soloists, chorus and orchestra, without any problems and without any organic connection to the day-to-day, week-to-week work and repertoire in the opera house. That, at least, is my experience of premieres that I've heard of composers like Peter Ertwersch, who's very much very modish today. His Three Sisters was given at the Edinburgh Festival a few years ago, in concert there. Also of Harrison Birtwistle in London. None of his operas has actually been taken up by another company other than the one that produced them. And Aribert Dreimann, one of the leading German composers. In America, the experience is different. Again, new opera is expected to spring to life, fully grown. But in America, operas are expected to be a success even before the curtain is opened. They are basically triumphs of marketing. Unfortunately, very few of them have legs. They can't flourish outside the artificial culture in which they've been hatched. That's because, in most cases, they are plays turned, with varying degrees of success, into opera librettos. Their success is predicated on the fame or notoriety of the plays on which they're based. There's one other kind of American opera, and that is the docu-opera. built around a contemporary political event. One example is Michael Doherty's Jackie O, about Jackie Onassis. Another is Harvey Milk, about the gay San Francisco mayor. That had a brief flurry of performances because of the obvious notoriety of the subject. One of the more successful examples is Nixon in China. That one worked. It was the product of a constructive dialogue between a composer, John Adams, a librettist, Alice Goodman, and a director, Peter Sellers, all of them very aware of the practicalities of creating an opera. Nixon in China does have flaws. We don't know whether it will survive another 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We don't know whether those future generations will actually want to hear it. What we have to remember is that for every successful opera in the repertory today, there were hundreds and hundreds that fell by the wayside. We owe it to ourselves and to the future to keep the creative machine moving, providing opportunities for creators, both composers and their literary collaborators, to make their mistakes and to learn from them, and to bequeath to the future operas that reflect the problems and preoccupations and the artistic priorities of our time.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, no pressure, guys. I wonder if perhaps we could just start, given that you are living, breathing composers, a composer, you are a living, breathing composer and a living, breathing writer. It'd be just interesting, perhaps, if you could just take a few moments to share with the audience how you first fell into partnership, as it were.
Well, Louise and I were both on the same residency in Bamberg in Germany a few years ago. It was a great place where they invited artists from another country as well as German artists to live and stay in the same medieval and Baroque city in Bavaria. And obviously there was a mixture of writers and composers and visual artists there. So Louise and I became friends and admirers of each other's work before we ever thought about working together. I read Louise's books and went to her readings, and she came to performances of pieces of mine, and she would hear me practicing every day, actually, because my office was just down the stairs from her flat. And actually, it was when I was talking to Alex about this exciting 5:15 idea in about 2006 or 2007, I think, that I was having a chat with him about it, and we were talking about what the best direction to go in would be in terms of finding a librettist so that I could get involved with this project, because I was very keen on the development side of it as much as anything else, not just another opportunity to write an opera, but on, as you say, the opportunity to develop opera muscles was something that really appealed to me about the project. And what Alex and I had decided together about my first opera was that maybe my strong suit was not narrative and being able to tell the story in the simplest possible way. That's quite simply because the first time you do an opera, you don't know what you're doing as a composer, because no one has ever told you what to do. It's a totally different kettle of fish from writing for an orchestra or writing for a chamber ensemble. So immediately Louise's name popped into my mind, because I knew that from the books of hers that I'd read, that telling the story is exactly what Louise is wonderful at. And I'd literally, there were page turners, the books of Louise's that I'd read, and I thought, well, maybe that would work. And we both have an attraction, I think, to the darker sides of human activity, things like that. So I thought that it only extends to our art. Obviously, we're very nice people in real life, but thankfully, when I suggested Louise, Louise was interested in taking the discussion further, and I'll let you take it up from there, Louise.
Yeah, I think I was more than interested. I was really eager, and I'd been to the first performance of 5:15, and I'd been very, very, very jealous of all the writers, and the writers especially that had got involved with it. A good friend of mine, Ron Butlin, had done a libretto with Lyle Cresswell, and we went out for dinner before the piece, and I remember just being really pleased for him, obviously, but actually quite jealous that I hadn't somehow managed to get involved. So I really jumped at the chance when Stuart suggested it. And I think also as a writer, notoriously we necessarily spend a lot of time on our own working, and the opportunity to collaborate is, especially with somebody that you know and trust already, who you know is going to be able to come up with the goods, and you know is also going to be a pleasure to work with. That doesn't mean that we never disagree about things, but I think we always disagree with courtesy towards each other. We have that trust. We didn't have to do what some collaborations require, which is a lot of meetings before you actually feel confident enough to say, oh, I don't quite think that's. I think that's rubbish, actually. So we'd come a little bit along that road already, I think, and also, again, just to reiterate the chance to learn something, because I was an opera goer already. I wasn't a terribly knowledgeable one. I was somebody who went and did what I hope people do when they come to our piece. I sat back and I enjoyed it. I didn't dissect the structure or in that way. So the opportunity to learn something new, and part of what really attracted me to the project was that I wasn't being asked to adapt something. I wasn't being asked to take a short story or a play or a novel that I'd already written and adapt it for a different form. I was being asked to engage with a particular form and write with that in mind. And that, as a writer, is very satisfying. And we weren't being asked to write a shorter piece that would then somehow, by magic, be expanded and yet still have some integrity of form and structure. We were being asked to write a whole, to take a narrative and the music, and to make a 15-minute piece, and that was challenging but exciting.
Yeah. I think Alex had a role in this as well, because he gave us some guidance as to, after his first year's experience working on 5:15, he gave us some guidance as to how to maybe go about starting our discussions. And the one thing that he said that I think we kept in mind throughout was that Alex had asked, he said what he was looking for from the ideas, because he didn't just give us the commission just like that. We had to come to him with the ideas. It was a development process, and work on them and chat to him about it, as well as Mike McCarthy, who produced the 5:15 and is still producing them at the moment, I think. And Alex said that he was looking for, in 15 minutes, just a fulcrum around which the plot could turn. So it wasn't just 15 minutes of songs that happened to hinge around a particular idea, or a 15-minute kind of build-up to something that might happen later, but he wanted there to be a turning point. And I think that really helped us to give a focus to what we were doing, because it allowed us to explore one of the fundamentals of how opera works together, and work out ways that we could approach that. We went through quite a few, actually, possible things that could change. And rather than just working out some words and music that would go together, we were thinking about drama. And I think that's a crucial thing that's missing from the education that we composers have, is even composers that go to the opera, you build up relationships with orchestras, with chamber ensembles, even with singers, but you never have the chance to build up a relationship with an opera house usually, or you didn't, at least until a few years ago. So you don't actually get that opportunity to understand opera as drama, as theatre. It's interesting what Louise says about not dissecting it. I mean, dissecting is exactly what composers do when they go to the opera usually. Every composer I know does. We go along and we try and think, what is it that makes this work? And we're always thinking about the music. We're not thinking about how that relates intrinsically to everything else. Until, of course, you start getting involved with the medium in a practical way, such as we have now. And then you start to engage with it in a totally different way, that you see how the other elements are often just as important. I'm not sure I entirely agree with Andrew's idea that the music is the most important thing. I think certainly with historical operas, the ones that have survived have good music, most of them, but we all differ as to what good music and bad music is. I think that the thing that really makes an opera work is when all the arts present themselves equally. The partnerships involved may not be equal, but the arts and the elements that go into an opera have to be things that speak to each other on the stage and make an overall unit. And that's how really successful opera productions happen, I think. And obviously, having the right words there is the first thing that comes along. The music comes afterwards, really. And it's very important that when you're working with a librettist, you allow them to take forward the ideas and don't let your composerly side sort of get in the way,
I think that earlier on when you were talking about narrative, though, when you were talking about the story, I do think that you didn't give yourself actually quite enough credit, because each of our pieces, and as Alex was saying, we're now engaged on making a new piece, and each piece, the germ of the story has actually come from Stuart. You've been the one who had the central initial spark of a vision that has somehow then, usually in cafes, we meet in cafes and sit and talk, and where the cafe owners must really abhor us, because we have one cup of tea and a 2-hour conversation, just talking backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And we usually start talking about the opera about half an hour into it, and then a good hour and a half talk, and then we both go away and come back maybe a week later and continue that conversation about the idea that we had. And I think that's part of the usefulness of the particular commissioning process that we went through with Scottish Opera, that we weren't working with a committee, or we didn't feel like we were working with a committee. We were working with Alex and Mike, who gave us a lot of put us through our paces, actually. I didn't know until very late on, I felt, whether this was going to be a commission or not a commission. But our vision wasn't being weakened by a committee of people who said, well, I think this, and I think we were very engaged in that process, and a very supportive commissioning process. But I think that a lot of the story has come from those conversations. And then, of course, one goes and begins to write the libretto, and all sorts of things change, because a structure and a plan is not actually the piece. And as soon as you begin to write the piece, things become apparent that weren't apparent when you started. And so I sit and I worry and I worry and I worry. Will Stuart like the new piece?
Well, that's the thing. We've gone through, both times we've gone through a development process together of chatting about the ideas for the piece and trying, with a bit of encouragement from our mentors and commissioners, to work out how we're going to focus the ideas that we're having. Because obviously when you sit down every week or two with somebody and talk about ideas, you end up with masses of ideas and material, and a lot of it is about honing it down to what's really necessary and important. And in the end, what happens is it doesn't matter who came up with which original idea, it belongs to both of us. And often I can't remember which bit came from me and which bit came from Louise, because it comes out of these discussions. And I think that basis is necessary in order for us to be able to go away and do our own things once we get onto our specific jobs, because now we have a history with the piece that we're working on now. We have a history where we both understand equally well what's going on, what it is we're trying to achieve, and the various ways that we've tried to go about achieving it. But now I really have to let Louise just get on with her work while she does the libretto, and then there will be a little bit maybe of shuffling around once she has done that, but then I will have to go away and do my bit on my own, because ultimately you can't have a constant interference or constant working relationship. But I think making that platform the basis for what we then go away and do on our own is the important thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, Stuart, sorry, Louise. Stuart and Louise, indeed. Would you say that, given that the template you've described is relatively similar in terms of the initial approach to both the 15-minute piece and to this new 45-minute-ish collaboration that you're working on now for 2012, having had a sort of very similar-ish development process, what would you say the challenges are now heading towards a longer piece?
It's longer.
Longer.
Yeah, I think
More work.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing actually, just that it's a bigger beast, but that is all. I should say that, and I think of Stuart as being the senior partner, and we sit and have ask Stuart a lot of questions about structure, and also about timing and words, not just about voices and instruments, although we talk about that as well, but thinking very much about the structure of the piece. And those are the conversations that I actually really enjoy. I like to have this tight remit that I'm going to work to. So the other, Ron Butlin and Lyle Cresswell really laughed when I said, "Oh, my piece is going to be is going to have this number of words in it." They thought that this was very amusing, and yet for me that was really important to know each act how many words I was allowed. So quite, yeah. But I think it's very exciting.
I think last year you came in about 7 words under budget, so you can have them back for this piece.
Thank you.
Yeah, but you have to be quite strict, because actually when you start singing words, it takes an awful lot longer to get through them. And this is one thing that I always worried about before I got involved with writing opera, was whenever I'd seen a big load of words that I thought about setting, I realised it was going to last forever. And actually condensing a story that has subtlety and various levels and subplots and things that are going on underneath into such a small number of words, you have to say an awful lot with very, very little verbiage. I have to also describe to Louise the places where I think the music might do a lot of what she might normally do in several paragraphs of words in her novels, and that's not to overstate the effectiveness of the music that I write, but it's just necessary for opera to work in that way. You have to say a lot with little, and that for me is the challenge with. I actually found writing the 15-minute piece, once I got into it, a bit easier than I thought I would, and now I'm worried that doing something longer, I'm worried about keeping people's attention for that long and keeping it focused, but at the same time letting it breathe a little bit more, because you can't be at the threshold of intensity for 45 minutes. But I'm sure that the libretto that Louise gives me will give me the platform to do that with. That's the thing. I don't know what I'm going to get yet in terms of the exact words. But when they come, that's what gives me, that's where I start, really. That's where I start pacing the whole thing. So there's a lot of trust involved, isn't there, from both of us?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of trust. And also, in terms of challenge, I think often when you... It's a very big deal to us. I think part of the challenge is not to be frightened, just not to get that panic that can be a little bit paralysing. Just to be aware of what a big deal it is, and then do it. You know, feel the fear and do it anyway. Just to be quite brave and quite bold. I think most writing, after a certain point, after you've got to a certain point, writing is hugely about taking things away, just removing as much as putting things in. And writers, whatever they're writing, take much more out probably than they ever put in. And just, I think that's part of the pleasure of writing for the stage in any form, but especially with opera, knowing that the music will be there, the singers will be there, the orchestra will be there. And actually, opera singers in the 21st century are also very good actors. And so to trust the skill of the people around you and not to put too many words in.
I wonder, Andrew, if I could perhaps ask you if you've got any reflections on the process that Louise and Stuart have outlined for us this evening.
Well, it obviously sounds a very civilised way of doing things. One of the things that it made me think was to think back to the days I was describing when composers and librettists were working in the theatre. And of course, we tend to forget that in those days, every opera was new. They hardly had any revivals. Handel hardly ever saw any of his operas revived. And when he did, he tended to change them around quite a lot. So that's one aspect of how it can make composers and librettists a little over self-conscious today. And I think it's wonderful that these two, in a way, well, I think they've got over that. That they've learnt from their friendship in the first place that this idea of trust is very important in this respect. That not to be too, or just to get on with it, basically. I think that this way is, when I say it's very civilized, when you think back to how people like Richard Strauss and Hugo von Hofmannsthal did it, they hardly ever met. They sent letters to each other, and the libretto would sort of come in bits and bobs, and Strauss would react and start composing the first act, sometimes without even the words, because he got a whiff of what he was getting and started to run ahead of himself. And so then the thing had to be adapted that way. So let's face it, what has come through, I think, so far very much is that the librettist today has a much greater role, a much more important role in the equation than in the past. We expect much more meaty stuff from the librettist in terms of what the thing is telling us. We don't want it to be a play, yes, and we don't want it to be a kitchen sink dramatic experience. So we're not looking to EastEnders to be translated into opera. We're not probably going to get lines like, a soprano singing, "Can you sing me? Can you bring me a cup of tea?" Which you might have, when somebody's writing. Well, maybe I've said the wrong thing, but unless that particular soprano has just been ditched and is going through some kind of emotional trauma, then you can have that kind of simple request or simple statement can actually be turned into quite a big operatic moment in the right music. So the important thing that I think Louise and Stuart have shown is that opera actually is evolving, it's progressing. You can't go back and repeat formulas from the past. You have to find new ways, not formulas. You have to find new ways of doing it today and how it suits you. And if it is the right partnership, it will be totally unique and individual.
I think that's following on from that. It is a very pertinent point that most of the operas that are being staged are rather old pieces, and that means our competition, as it were, is not our contemporaries or other, modern operatic partnerships. It's Massenet and it's Puccini and it's Verdi, and you wouldn't dare compare yourself with any of those or their achievements, but at the same time, that is what you're competing for airtime with, as it were, or for stage time with. And it does actually put the pressure on. We don't have this kind of culture where a given composer or librettist would be writing 3 or 4 operas a year for 10 years, as Handel was doing. You have a situation where, because it's one piece, maybe the one new piece in 3 years that a given opera company is doing, if it's a full-length piece, there is an expectation that it will work, and it does make it, quite a big effort to get involved with it. That's why feeling that you're part of a team is actually, it gives you a real feeling of safety in numbers, I think.
It does,
helps a lot.
we can go and drown our sorrows together if it all goes wrong. I was very interested in what Andrew was saying, though, about the different ways that composers have worked in the past, because and librettists have worked together in the past. Because I think also, I think Stuart would agree, we don't know the right way to do it. We just, or there isn't a right way to do it. And as a writer, I always feel I never have a manifesto for writing. I think people find the way, hopefully, that suits their partnership, and I'm sure that other people in 515 work completely differently, or perhaps do it by email as well, which I wouldn't like, because I want to get out and see the world a little bit. I spend far too much time at my desk.
Thank you.
I wonder if we're quietly ready to take some questions from the floor. I think Susan, Dr. Ian.
I was very encouraged to hear what virtually all of you were saying. Perhaps you didn't say it as clearly as I would. As I would have said it, but I would probably have gone over the top anyway. But opera has, as drama, one great advantage over straight theatre in that the music can convey all sorts of emotions and meanings which are very much more difficult if you simply have people speaking on stage. For example, you can relate back to things that were done in the past, you can hint at things coming in future, and you can also have 4 or 5 people, if you like, expressing quite independent emotions at the same time. All of those things are almost impossible in the theatre. Certainly you can convey them much more readily with opera, and the way that you were saying you go about it, I find extremely encouraging. It's interesting, as Andrew Clark was saying, that 50 years ago, Pierre Boulez said these things. He said, if I remember correctly, it's a long time ago, that the text should not, in a real opera, exist without the music, that one without the other doesn't have an independent existence. If I remember well, he also said that the ideal place to have such an opera would be in a small theatre where you could risk all sorts of things. I find it very encouraging that all of these things now seem to be coming, which is, I think, excellent. Boulez was certainly not a very diplomatic gentleman. He did speak then of blowing up opera houses, and he said it in the course of an interview for a German magazine, Der Spiegel, obviously forgetting that just a few years earlier that very fate had befallen German opera houses at the hands of the Royal Air Force. But that's by the way.
He was a firebrand, and he's one, still is, of course, and is one of my great heroes, Boulez. But I think the opera house, the blowing up opera houses phrase that he used, I think he's come to regret it since then. I think he says now that he was aiming more at the bourgeois nature of opera going, and the fact that most of the operas that were being produced, again, were old pieces and not new, and he was determined that new music should become the predominant culture, a quest in which, of course, he failed, but he did his best to make it happen. And I think it's telling, though, that Boulez is one of the few composers of that generation from Darmstadt that never actually made an opera. He has said that he would have done if the right libretto ever came along, but I suspect that he never looked too much for a partnership in opera in a sort of humble way that I think you have to do if you're going to start from the bottom up. I think he kind of was hoisted by his own petard a bit, and I think he could have been a great opera composer because he writes wonderful vocal music and has written wonderful vocal music. But yes, he's an interesting example. I don't think the modernists were all completely against opera, but I think it just didn't suit what it was they were trying to achieve.
Thank you. Gentleman, the third row.
Yes, opera, as mentioned, is a blend between music, libretto, and design. But this evening we haven't heard very much about design. And I wondered, are there particular problems in relation to design in a short opera that is telling a whole story? And at what stage does design come into the design of this opera or the creation of it?
Thank you. I might have a first crack at that. When we set about conceiving and breathing life into the 5:15 idea, the 5 short opera idea, I was determined that we wouldn't get bogged down in the stuff of opera, the endless amounts of scenery and props and costumes and all the other, all the kind of contributors to the artifice of it all. What I wanted was there to be a degree of truthfulness, if you like, around the storytelling. So in our particular case, we took a view that said we wanted the 2 or 3 directors that were involved every year were briefed clearly that they were to work on a very simple and open set and to require the audience to use their imagination as much as was possible, because every time you introduce another layer of complexity, I was nervous that it was going to just, do you really need 4 sofas when in fact a simple grey bench would do in the context of a 15-minute opera. The other interesting twist about this particular 515 in terms of our design interpretation was to say, traditionally speaking, the orchestra would sit between the audience and the singers. And we know from the extensive regional touring that Scottish Opera does, sometimes with piano, sometimes with chamber orchestra, that some of the halls we go to, the experience is limited for the audience because the stage is not high enough and the orchestra is sitting on the floor. And you have both a visual world and a sound world that the audience can't penetrate. You can't hear the singers over the top of the orchestra, and even if you could, you couldn't see them. So we took a view that with 515, what we needed to do was effectively, and Andy Storer, the designer, very cleverly created a sort of figure 8, and that the orchestra, the chamber orchestra, were buried or set inside the rear part of the figure 8, so that whilst Derek Clark, the conductor, has to be a little bit of a contortionist to communicate both with the orchestra and the singers, nevertheless that the most important thing from an audience point of view was hearing what was being sung. And also in a context of using younger or newer voices, we didn't want to give them too many hurdles to overcome. I mean, as we head into the longer piece that Stuart and Louise are working on, it will be more fully staged. But certainly in the context of new work, again, I wanted to keep it all as simple and as straightforward and as truthful to the music and the words as possible. Does that answer your question? Yeah, very good. Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Question for Louise. Question for Louise. Words on the page are very different from spoken words, which are even more different from sung words. I wonder what problems that you, originally as a writer of texts, found in writing for the voice.
So it's a really good question. When I'm writing novels, I read each piece out loud as I go along. If it sounds strange when you read it out loud, if you stumble when you're reading out loud, the reader will also stumble on the page. It's a good way of pointing up what's wrong. And I have written for stage plays, so I'm used to, in a way, thinking about the voice in that sense. How does it sound? How does it work? The only way that I could find to write the libretto was also partly to make up tunes as I did it, and also to think very much about rhythm. So as I'm writing the piece that Stuart and I are working on together, I'm still banging out the rhythm and thinking about the rhythm, and we've discussed we've discussed very closely the structure of it, so I know roughly or hopefully quite well what that is. But I didn't give Stuart any of the tunes that I made up, and not last time, and they weren't very good, but it somehow had to function for the voice. And we did have a lot of conversations about words, word length, that kind of thing. And we've been very, very fortunate. Scottish Opera, since before the commissioning of the first opera, they've invited us to every opera that they've put on. And yeah, as part of an education, hopefully. And I've started watching opera on DVD that Stuart's given me, and so I think it's still a big challenge. And when I hand the libretto to Stuart, it will be as finished as I can make it, but it won't be finished. The process will still continue after that.
Louise told me the other day that the section that she's been working on has a repeating rhythm underneath it, so that probably saves me about a week's work.
Yeah.
If I could ask a PS to that then, too, bearing in mind what Andrew said, do you feel you're more writing poetry than your usual form? And I mean, would you exclude such a line as "I'm going for a cup of tea," which might drive a narrative forward?
Oh, yeah. If it served the opera, then I guess I smiled when Andrew said sometimes the poetry was horrible. Sometimes they got horrible poets, because of course I would prefer to be a poet. I'd rather be a poet than a novelist. I can't, because I write horrible poetry. I usually, at some point each year, I'm moved to write a poem it's horrible, I put it away and don't bother anybody with it. So in a sense, the opportunity to write a libretto is much more like poetry, and yet it's not quite poetry yet. And I think my libretto wouldn't function without the music at all. But hopefully, it serves the music and serves the piece as a whole. So yeah. Horrible poetry.
but at the same time, the libretto Louise gave me for Remembrance Day had so many poetic turns of phrase that when you read it, every time I read through it, I found connections between this and that. Structurally, things were beautifully crafted. So there's a lot of poetry in there. It just doesn't quite manifest itself as a poem. But I'd say it seems... When it comes out, it seems almost poetic. It's a very strange hybrid kind of thing, but that's what makes it propel the music.
And I guess I do write some poetic prose when I'm writing novels. And I think it's perhaps also we're trying to do something else. We're trying to get an idea of speech, but of course it isn't actual speech. It's an opera reality, if you like. So there are half rhymes and there are rhythms and there are different structures, and it's actually hugely pleasurable to work on. It's such close work, and I started off perhaps as some poets do by writing down a lot of vocabulary, thinking about words that I might use for this particular text, this particular subject, and then mucking about with them. So it's a different way of writing than when I'm writing straight prose.
Thank you. I wonder whether you either regard it as a worthwhile aim or can do it if you wanted, that you can protect sort of budding opera composers who are hoping to learn from the experience of seeing their work performed from the depredations of contemporary producers and designers. I mean, anybody who has seen your current Bohème will know what I mean. That would seem to me to be a very important issue. If composers and librettists are hoping to learn from seeing their work produced, then it has to be their work that is being produced. And frequently in contemporary productions of opera, I have seen one or two new operas which I thought were ruined by the production. Might have been very much more interesting if the producer had tried to do what the composer librettist appeared to want to do and not something else. Do you take that into consideration?
I think there's probably two parts to that question. Part A is La Bohème, and we might just park that for a moment. But part B is to say that we deliberately, first of all, that with the composer and the librettist having finished work, the third part of the triangle is the director, or the producer as you referred to them. They are charged with breathing life into the theatrical or the stage performance. Now, how they choose to interpret the work is entirely, well, not entirely up to them, but largely a reflection of their own skills, strengths, experiences, artistic temperament, artistic sensibilities. What we've tried to do with 515 to date is to make sure that in having a relatively bare and indeed uninterrupted sort of performance space, that the producers' intentions and wishes don't really get in the way of giving these pieces first outing. I suspect in time, as we go on to do longer works, that in order for the audience to be taken on a journey, a bare stage won't be sufficient to take an audience with us for 45 or 50 or 60 minutes. So in which case we'll have to bring directors to bear on them. I suppose the best I can do is try to reassure you that the directors that we'll be working with will have a degree of moderation, I guess, in their artistic perspectives. I would say with regard to Bohème, and it's probably not a subject to dwell on now, but interestingly, in the same way that the creation of new work is organic, and the work that's going on now here in Scotland is different from what was going on 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So it is right that an opera company encourage a range of directors to have a range of points of view on operas such as La Bohème. And interestingly, for every person who has written to me with or made comments to me about their views on the production, negative views on the production, or less pleased, or not best pleased, shall we say, I've also had many, many other people saying for them it was, it was an eye-opener and it was a piece that they really enjoyed and they finally understood the opera. So I guess that's part of the journey of working both with an audience and with directors. But perhaps we could chat about that later if you like. In the front, second to front row, lady.
I'm interested in your comments on the baggage of costume and set, which I do appreciate are expensive. I have seen Russian productions years ago where you waited for about half an hour between one act and another while they shifted loads of hefty scenery, which is not a good idea. But I actually rather like the concept of the concert performance of an opera. Once, a couple that I saw in last year's festival were absolutely stunning, and nothing was lost in the quality or the interpretation through not having a set. And again, I think, and I've just seen, Mr. Brauchek, and with modern technology and shifting sort of translucent curtains and screens, you can get away without having. Well, you don't have to have 4 sofas. You don't have the conflict between 4 sofas or the bench. Yeah. It's just a point I thought was quite... was a way of dealing with... I mean, essentially what you're doing, I would think, with 5:15 are concert performances.
More like semi-staged performances, I'd have said. Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. In the back row.
I'm just wondering, with the experience now of having done the first opera, working on the second, in very practical terms, working with the singers, did you have to change things and did you learn through that? For example, the singers might not like certain vowel sounds, right, screeching at the top of their voice or whatever. And also, are you writing for specific voices in mind? And if so, is that really influencing, or do you not know at this stage who you're writing for?
I guess that's one for me. To start at the end of the question, as it were, I don't know who I'm writing for yet. I will have to decide what voice types, and that doesn't just mean is it a tenor or is it a baritone or is it a soprano. It's what kind of tenor, what kind of baritone, what kind of soprano. And then working backwards, I've learned not to use certain vowel sounds on loud high bits. I've learned that certain singers are able to do certain things other ones can't. So the most important thing is when you get to the rehearsal process, to be adaptable and to be willing to adapt and change what you've done. It only takes very slight changes, actually, to make it work in a better way. And also at the writing stage, sometimes Louise gave me a line in which I couldn't see any way of avoiding a climactic point or a high point or whatever being on an impractical kind of vowel or an impractical word, or the rhythm or the length of the phrase wasn't right. And in those cases I would get back to Louise with some special pleading and say, do you think we could maybe do this instead, or do you think you could find a way of making these lines get longer gradually so that we end up with a long one for this climactic point? And she was very good about that, and it was only a couple of sections, I think, but that was specifically in order to avoid these sorts of problems with singers that you mention. The start of your question was something I've forgotten now what that was. See, that's the problem with working backwards, isn't it? What was the start of your? There was. It was the experience of working with singers and changes. Yeah, I mean, I don't like workshops personally. Some composers really like to workshop things at all sorts of stages with singers. For me, that just kind of disturbs the flow of my work. And for every 2 hours of workshop, I might get lots of interesting and useful things, but that would set me back by about 50% of the time I've already spent on that work. And I have to keep it going. So I have to have an approach where I try and get everything right first time. But if I don't, I'm usually pretty flexible and adaptable, and I like to be there with the singers as they start to rehearse the piece. so that when I can see that things aren't working, I can say, look, let's try this a different way. What will work best for your voice? And that's one of the lovely things of opera, actually, is working with singers. I love discovering their voices and how you can tailor what you've done just with some little small changes to what they're able to do best.
I think that's also part of the pleasure of a collaboration, is the fact that there are more people and you all have the same aim, which is to make the best possible production that you can. And I really enjoyed it when, Andrew, when you were talking historically and saying in the opera house, they would have hacks in the opera house and they would just know what they were doing, they would hack it out. But I guess part of me is a hack. You know, normally what I do takes a long period of time, but I think there's also a huge pleasure in somebody saying, this bit isn't quite working, can you change it? And then managing to change it and managing to solve the problem. And I think that's often true in anything creative or scientific. It's solving the problem that gives you the most satisfaction somehow.
Hello there. I'm just wondering, as a librettist, if you have a view on the diction of singers.
Oh gosh, not really actually. I think I like to be able to.
Specifically, I mean, how much of your words do you mind being lost in any given performance?
Oh, not a single one.
Not a single one.
Yeah, I think it's also though writing words that are possible to be sung as well. And so thinking about, so as Stuart said, some words which are actually short words can take a long time to say. Some words that are actually long and multisyllable can serve you very, very well too. So I think my task is to try, hopefully, to write things that are possible to sing as well and possible to have good diction on. But no, I have the ego of any other creative artist, and I don't want anything to for my genius to be lost.
So following on from that, do you have an opinion on having the libretto for the audience, especially a new work? Because obviously nobody knows what it's about.
Yeah.
I mean, you get a rough idea, but then, or do you think that takes away from the performance side of it?
I think it's necessary to I as a opera goer, I want to have the libretto. I usually don't choose to read it until I get home, but I think it really is each individual's choice. And I have, of course, been looking at various librettos to try and make myself better. But I think I am also quite concerned with narrative, and often I childishly don't want any of the surprises to be gone. So it's as much the whole of the piece, the whole of the narrative, that I would prefer people not to know. But yeah, you can't really stop them if they want to.
Well, I think I just wanted to ask a question about when the composer and the librettist are the same person. Clearly we can think of Wagner, but I was just wondering whether that was really the aberration and whether there are other examples of successful operas where there have been that, where it's possible. I vaguely think that Messiaen's St. Francis was largely written by Messiaen, both text and they. It makes me the mischievous thought that perhaps these are the reasons why they're both the longest operas that you ever encounter. But what would it require of a composer to be the librettist? What I'm really trying to get at is that combination of composer and librettist really the most sensible, best way of doing it?
Andrew?
Yes.
Well, with Wagner, of course, he was a man who just could not collaborate with anybody else. He had such belief in himself, and he had such a huge mind and incredible theatrical skill and knowledge and incredible philosophical knowledge of his literary sources. He was so widely read. I mean, he was just Mr. I don't know, he just could do everything, from designing to conducting to writing the thing. Of course, if his librettos had been less philosophically and dramatically fertile, we would probably not know about him so much today. A case in point, more of today's world and also relevant to Scottish opera's recent experience, is Michael Tippett, who you may remember The Knot Garden was done about 6 or 7 years ago. Now, thanks to the production, that worked really well, but Tippett was another person who believed in doing the libretto himself. I'm afraid he wasn't nearly as gifted as Wagner. The Knot Garden was a lot shorter than even something like The Flying Dutchman, which is obviously one of the shortest of Wagner operas, but it was very fragile, and I think generally it is the exception today, and that's a very good instance, The Knot Garden. It needs a hell of a good production to carry it, because I saw another production of a chamber version of The Knot Garden about 6 months after that was done by Music Theatre Wales that went to London, and in fact that was a flop, and you could really see the holes and the weaknesses of it, and that's why I think when you have this constructive, creative meeting of minds and you can spar off each other, you get well over double the value. You get many times the value what you might get if one mind was just working with his wonderfully egotistical and capable mind himself.
I think one
particularly the last point you made about Knot Garden and similar operas. I have a private ambition, not a personal ambition, that sometime in the future someone will take those operas, not just the Knot Garden, but the other ones, and provide them with better librettos, because they really are so bad. Not just the Knot Garden, all these other operas as well.
But then there'll be a totally different work, and you can't revise who's going to. I mean, you know. I'm sorry, I think that's totally impractical. Then you're going to create a different work, and to suddenly take the music and then put new words, I think that's a little dodgy, and I think you might end up with something a hell of a lot worse than you got in the first place.
You could translate them into another language, of course, and that could solve all the problems.
Hello, hi. I was wanting to ask, just generally, you were saying about the trust and between yourselves, and the idea that both text and the music kind of embody the same sentimental meanings and stuff to create an ultimate voice, like Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk and stuff. But I was wanting to ask, how do you control the musical and lyrical narrative and their relationship within the opera itself? Because you can't have one without the other, obviously.
Difficult question. Well, I can only answer from the composer's perspective, obviously, but when you're in the middle of writing an opera, it's very much like, I suppose it's like juggling. You've got several balls in motion at one time, and you are thinking with every single bar, with every syllable, with every word, you're thinking of how it relates to the character that's singing, the character that is on stage with the one that's singing, the place in the timescale of the opera, the place in the imaginary history of the characters of the opera, as well as the musical flow, and as well as the relationship to other words that have come before and will come later in the opera. You have to be thinking of all these things at once, really. That's the way I do it anyway. I mean, obviously it's different if you have the kind of opera that has an aria where somebody focuses on that moment, and then there's a more narrative section. But in these narrative sections, it's very much about trying to think about how everything relates to everything else in 3 dimensions or 4 dimensions, rather than just thinking of that moment itself and how it's working. How the pacing of the thing works and narratively is that is something that is partly dictated by the libretto, by the way it shifts from one mood to another, the way characters react. When I was writing the piece with Louise, I filled a few pages of my notebook going through each character's journey separately, so that I would write what mood they are here, what mood they're in the next line, and I'd literally had a kind of a scheme of the moods that each character went through, and I put them all next to each other, and then I tried to find the patterns within that, and that by doing that tried to get all the different threads of the music working as a whole, So the thing ended up being quite multi-layered and multi-textured in a way, but at the same time, it's very easy to overcomplicate it that way, and you can end up with something that's just out of control. So I suppose there's a little bit of taking a chance there, a little bit of trying to get it right and just hoping that the pacing of it works. It's the most difficult aspect you've asked about, basically, but for me, is to get that sense of moving forward in the drama, but not at a pace that people can't follow it and can't follow the emotions and the reactions of the characters.
I think that's probably a really good question to end on, isn't it? Food for thought there.
It's difficult, that's the way.
I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to Louise and Stuart for joining me up here this evening. I think you've absolutely answered the question, the role of the composer and the librettist in the creation of opera. I think you've set out really clearly, beautifully, wonderfully the strength of your relationship, and for me you really sum up the levels of trust and collaborative participation that goes on between two very clever people. So thank you. And Andrew, thank you also for your perceptive insights and overview on not only the history of opera, 400 years of opera in about 5.5 minutes. That's fantastic. But also the fascinating insight into the relationship between the East and the West. So thank you for joining us this evening.